Welcome. Can people hear me? Those of you who are on Zoom. You just let me know in the chat if I'm coming through okay. All right, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Just so you know, we are recording. I plan to publish this. The Indiana State MPA program has a YouTube channel, so I want to publish it there, and I may publish it in some other formats as well, but just for all of your awareness. So welcome everyone. My name is Nathan Myers. I'm the director of the Master of Public Administration program at Indiana State University. And this is a panel on public administration and careers in economic development and community development. So we have two panelists, both of whom are graduates of the MPA program, and I'll allow them to introduce themselves in a moment. But thanks, those of you who are joining us online. Appreciate your participation today. Throughout the course of the panel, I'll be asking them some questions, and then if you have any questions, there will be time towards the end for audience questions, but if you have questions along the way, feel free to type them into the chat room and we can take them as they come. So feel free to, as I said, interject any questions into the chat room if there's anything of interest that comes up. So we'll start with the introduction of the panelists. So Michael, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Michael Shaw, currently the planner for the Thrive West Central here in Terre Haute. It's a nonprofit, and my place is rural transportation planning. I got my MPA, just graduated in May. I'm only in my third month with this job. Undergrad was economics from ISU, and another bachelor's in geography and sustainability from here at ISU also.
All right, and we also have Andrea Zimmerman. So Andrea, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you. Yeah, we can hear you now.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Andrea Zimmerman. I am the current Deputy Chief of Staff at the Indiana Department of Transportation. I graduated from ISU with my MPA in December of 2020. And before that, I received my bachelor's in communications and then in political science at IU Bloomington in 2014.
All right, thank you very much and welcome. So you both have started to answer my first question, which was kind of talking about your educational path that led you to your current position. But if you could talk a little bit more about kind of why you ended up in your current position, kind of what led you to your current position or interested you, how you became involved in the organization that you're in. So Michael, if you wanted to start.
I was always interested in a couple things: transportation, sanitation, economic development, urban planning, and something with the hospitals, because I have about 10 years experience with medical supplies. After I got my econ degree here in 2022, I didn't want to go back to the real world and get a real job. I wanted to continue my education, get my master's degree, apply for this program. And I thought it would mix well with my economics and geography background. And then when I was looking for a job, this planner position came available. When I had my first one-on-one interview with the manager, what we discussed mostly was my capstone paper, was about gas taxes and what I would do differently about any fundraising for improving our roads. So I think my capstone paper pretty much secured my job, or at least their interest in me, and it continues doing what I want to do this job.
Great. Thanks, Michael. Andrea?
Sure. So I started my career as an intern with the Indiana House of Representatives, more on their communication side, but really discovered that I had a love of policy and kind of working with lawmakers on tweaking legislation or tweaking current or future laws that could help better the state. And I was really driven for the MPA program to see how I could advance that through civil service and continue working with elected officials. So while I was in my MPA program, I stayed on with the House of Representatives. And then recently after that, I went on to the Department of Transportation to work as their legislative director. So I was able to work firsthand in some of that policy world and also still work in public administration directly within that agency. I've been fortunate to recently move up into my deputy chief of staff role. And I always tell people that I'm so glad I took the MPA courses before I moved into this position with everything that it taught me. And I think it kind of, the courses really showcased to people that those abilities were there, and I had given myself the foundation to continue to move on and progress in civil service and to have kind of the duality of working with lawmakers, but also in managing other state employees.
All right, thanks, Andrea, very much for that. So turning to Michael again first, I know you're new in this position, so this may be premature in some ways, but what would you say is the most rewarding thing about the position that you hold right now?
I think you ask me this next year or 2 years from now, stuff I'm working on now be implemented. Like right now, we're just in the planning stages, and it can take years for everything to go through. So I'm just thinking a couple years from now, I'm going to enjoy what I'm doing right now. Like the hard work we're doing now is going to have an impact in the future, near future, and that gives me the push to continue going.
Do you wanna say anything more about the projects that you're working on right now?
So my big main project so far has been see if I get the Railroad Crossing Elimination Grant Program from the Federal Railroad Administration. I'm trying to help the city of Terre Haute receive $7.5 million to create an overpass on 13th Street and 8th Avenue. There's too many wrecks and too many hazards right there. That's the one I'm doing, that we're doing the final week next week. Other projects I've worked on has been in Lake County, in their safe streets for all, trying to make the streets safer and make them more complete, so they have bike lanes, sidewalks, stuff. Another thing is a bike pedestrian trails, so we can get sidewalks and other type of trails. People get connectivity to big cities, to the parks, to the schools, to the hospitals. And a couple other like data searching I've done was for Montgomery County, where it's owner occupied rehabilitation. And we just applied for that grant a couple weeks ago, hopefully you hear back. But that's be able to get like 25,000 to needy homeowners to help improve their houses. So better houses, better community, better economic growth, better happiness.
Good. Thank you. Andrea?
One of the most rewarding things about my position is there's a lot of work that goes into transportation planning. And so when I finally see orange construction barrels go out, I know it's a lot of times when most people are most frustrated with the Department of Transportation, but when I see the orange construction barrels go out, it's really rewarding to me because it's the kind of the visual representation of planning and taxpayer dollars being put to good use. And, from conversations with legislators on how much gas tax is reasonable to where locations for good projects are to asset and maintenance and preservation for how good pavement and concrete hold up during winter storms. So it's the whole culmination of everything that the whole entire agency does is visually represented by an orange cone. So every time I drive through construction or I'm stuck in traffic, or for me, it's still frustrating to be stuck in behind, but it's still fun to see everything that we do actually culminate into a project and be closer to the finish line than I think people realize when we start breaking ground.
All right, very good. Thanks both of you for answers there. Now, You might be expecting the next question, which is what is the greatest challenge or challenges associated with your position? So I'll start again with Michael.
Like we were talking earlier, I've been to about 4 or 5 public engagement meetings. We're getting a handful of people, 10 we had on Monday for a different project. And just getting people involved and interested into what's going on. I think that's the biggest so far, and then just because I've been here just over 2 months, just learning acronyms, all the grant specifications, the wordage, just learning that in the last couple of months, probably been the hardest, but it's what's pretty much every job.
All right, thank you, Michael. Andrea?
A large challenge in my role is just the sheer amount of competing interests that come along. Everybody wants their road to be perfect tomorrow. They don't want to pay taxes. They don't want XYZ program, or they do want XYZ program. So it's just finding those compromises when they're available. You know, whether that's finding a yes and or a no but. How can we make compromises that are both worth taxpayer dollars, good for the agency, good for the state, and ethical too. Sometimes requests we get aren't of the highest caliber. So how do we navigate all those challenges? And so the amount of competing interests, I think continually am amazed by, and every time we work through those challenges, it feels like one step in the right direction for the agency.
All right, thank you very much. I appreciate that. So both have already, I think, touched upon maybe a little bit, but if you could talk a little bit about how concepts, public administration concepts have helped you in your career in different areas. So we'll start with Michael.
I think give me at least a background of what to expect for this job. Like, I keep hearing stuff I knew, so now I'm just going back and learning more in depth. So it gave me a good foundation of what to expect, and it just gives me just good groundwork to start at this job.
Okay, Andrea?
One of the courses I remember most is organizational behavior. Managing people, I feel like, has so many nuances, and it's ever evolving as your staff changes, as the people you work with change, as we get a different governor or different administration or different leadership. So organizational behavior is one of those that I didn't realize how vital it would be to me, learning those concepts and understanding that, and within managing personnel. And I feel like that, combined with some of the budgeting courses that you have in the MPA program, really help with how agencies and state government operates long-term, how you have to advocate and lobby for the funding you need and be able to have that minimum threshold to operate. And then what are the needs and wants, and be able to distinguish that with the folks that you work with. Because everyone views that their program is the most vital, but how do you articulate that to those who are ultimately deciding your funding for the future?
So kind of along similar lines, but if you could talk a little bit about the most memorable or valuable information that you gained from the program. Anything that sort of stuck with you as you've been working, or maybe just kind of stuck with you in general. So, Michael.
So I think public mission mistake, I'm looking at different organizations differently, how it was outlined what's good about the organization, companies, what's bad about it. Like when I was looking for a job, do I want to work in this kind of atmosphere compared to a different one? And just like mission mystique, but like she said, but budgeting, just understand government budgeting better now, and leadership, HR. When I talk to the HR, better communication, and I think normal person who didn't take the classes like this.
Andrea?
Portion that sticks out to me is, at least in some of the courses I was in, we did a lot of discussion boards, and there was a lot of communicating on the subject matter, and then everyone's own take on the subject and how they interpreted the reading and how they could apply it to their careers or maybe a future career. And honestly, as a student, it wasn't my favorite assignment to ever do. But now thinking back, I really value the difference of opinions and difference of interpretation that provided me in the moment. And so every time now that I'm in a meeting and I'm hearing all these different things, I feel like, oh, I feel like I've discussed this in a message board with fellow students before. So it was just nice to have that background, and it really prepared me for different meetings and to be ready for all those competing interest groups or different perspectives that maybe I wouldn't have considered before, but now have been illuminated to me otherwise. So.
All right, thank you very much. And just to clarify a little bit for those of you who may not have had the pleasure of reading it, Michael was referring to, there's a book called Mission Mystique by Charles Goodsell. It's kind of an older book at this point. It was published, I think, back in 2011. But it basically, Goodsell like studied several different federal, state, and local agencies and basically came up with a rubric for evaluating what was an exemplary agency. And he looked at things like communication and ability to innovate and connect, staying connected to the mission and adhering to the mission and things like that. For people who are interested in kind of, how do you evaluate whether a government agency is performing well or not? I think it's a good book in terms of just providing kind of an objective framework that separates out, the kind of the political and ideological perspectives on it. So in terms of the next question, what is the most significant challenge in your field right now that you would like to see public administration research or public administration courses paying more attention to? So we can start with Michael.
So being a nonprofit, we get contracted in to basically work on grants and just understanding exactly what needs to be put into a grant. The one thing that my supervisor told me to look into was understanding what notice of funding opportunities are, NOFOs, and able to read them, know exactly what it's saying, how we can do it for our grants, so we have a better chance of succeeding in our grant writing. So I know we talked a little bit about grant writing, just trying to find grants within our discussion board and stuff. Probably going more in depth into actually writing it or understanding what exactly needs to be put into a grant.
Okay, so grant writing and understanding what are in the actual notice of funding opportunity documents. Okay, that's a good suggestion. Andrea, what about you?
I would say communication in general, but of communication of new projects or programs that maybe aren't widely publicly accepted, but are publicly needed. So for instance, in the Department of Transportation, safety is a big concern. So we often talk about how do we communicate for drivers to be safer, what methods, we always tell people follow the speed limit, wear your seatbelt, but people continually perish because they aren't doing either of those. So what level of communication is the most effective to get people to maybe comply with measures that are for their best benefit, but they view as possibly against their own personal liberties? So it's always a fine line to continue to advocate for programs that people may view as an infringement of their freedom.
Thank you very much. For those of you who are watching online, feel free to put in any of your own questions, and also put it to Andrea and Michael if you think of any questions that you would like to pose to each other. I did that in the last panel, and it was kind of interesting, kind of the discussion that they had, because they were, again, working in similar fields, so there were some connections there. But before we get into any of that, Michael, you had mentioned your capstone and kind of discussing your capstone when you applied for your current position. Did you want to elaborate more about kind of what that capstone was about and how you ended up kind of researching that as your capstone? And again, just for clarification, the capstone is the final research project that MPA students do in the program. So if you want to provide a little background and information on that.
So it's been a few months now, but I forgot some of it. But was how government policies affect gas prices And I wanted to focus a lot on gas taxes, because that's where my senior seminar was. So I wanted to take what I learned in the MPA program, add it to what I did for my econ paper. And then it was just understanding that gas prices are fragile. There's no one person that can say it, how we can go around like prices, and how just there's many aspects to it. And then how green cars, green initiatives can be hurting our highway systems, so they're not getting the funding from the gas taxes. And how I propose that we should raise gas taxes by 3 cents nationwide, and how some people think that's gonna be political suicide. The politician actually brought that through.
Yeah, the issue with electric automobiles reducing the gas tax revenue and kind of how states are going to deal with that. I've read several stories just recently. I thought of you actually when I saw those. It is becoming a serious issue for the state. So, and is that something that you like? How did that come up in your conversation when you were meeting with? When you were having that interview, like how did that even come up as a topic?
Well, she's pretty much the director of rural transportation. And I was like, yeah, this, so what'd you hear about us? Another friend of mine actually interviewed before I did. When he, like, this is exactly what I was into. So that's why he forwarded me the application and I applied. But it was like, rural transportation, this is what I wrote my capstone paper on. And then she looked into green cars and gas taxes and stuff. So just mention that brought up like 15-minute tangent from the review.
Good. So Andrew, you had mentioned earlier, and this is also kind of related to gas taxes, because you mentioned communicating with legislators about, you know, the need for maybe, you know, what level the gas taxes need to be set at in order to have adequate funding. So if you could talk just a little bit more about kind of the strategy that the department uses in terms of, you know, trying to sell, you know, if there does need to be an increase, how do you convince legislators that there needs to be an increase, and how do you communicate with different audiences who have different perspectives on taxation and transportation and everything?
Sure. I actually, Michael, glad to hear that you're on there and that's something that you're passionate about. The department is currently in the throes of these conversations because the state and a lot of folks in the nation and other states are kind of on this precipice of a funding conundrum. The gas tax on the federal level hasn't been raised in, I think, over 2 decades. And on the state level, it's currently indexed statutorily, and it's aligned with CPI, the consumer price index with inflation. And so that does sunset in a few years. So the ongoing conversation with legislators that we're having and trying to educate them on is, you know, is gas tax still a viable mechanism to produce adequate funding for transportation? If it is, you know, what is the kind of breaking point for that? There's a lot of fuel tax inequity happening as well. As people start to adopt electric vehicles, the charges that are given to electric vehicles on their registration fees aren't adequately compensating for the amount of damage that they're doing to roadways and bridges. And also, it's not paying for their overall charges on the road. So those who stay with combustion engines are effectively paying more than their fair share in gas tax. So conversation's been around that equity, and then also what other mechanisms do we have in place? Some states look at vehicle miles traveled or road user charges. Other states look at tolling. And so it's really been probably a 2-year discussion at this point since the last biennium budget with legislators, working on a revenue study and trying to educate them on what their revenue options are, what is most viable for the agency, and then how we can move forward, especially in light of electric vehicles. Indiana's electric vehicle fees go to what's called the Community Crossings Matching Grant Fund. It's a local road and bridge fund that is specifically set aside for them. So the state infrastructure does not get any of that funding, but rather local communities can get up to $1.5 million to rehabilitate any of their assets. So as EVs increase, that fund pot increases, which is great for locals, but they have to continue matching that amount for their grants while state money continues to decrease. So is there a possibility that we change how electric vehicles pay for their share of the road use? Is there a way that we change how programmatically the state calculates in their taxes or other road use charges? So I'm really looking forward to January when the legislative session starts, because we're already kind of in the swing of having these discussions, and we'll kind of shift over to true advocacy for different mechanisms that we think are best for Indiana's transportation network.
Thanks.
If you're-
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, I wanted to mention, if either of you are interested, there's a task force called Funding Indiana's Roads for a Safer, Stronger Tomorrow. We recently just had a committee meeting with both the House and Senate, where NDOT presented its revenue study, and there were several other groups. The local transportation asset program with Purdue presented, and a few other, the Association of Indiana Municipalities. We all talked about different road funding challenges. So it's the perfect timing to get in the game if you're interested in transportation or road funding.
Thank you. I appreciate you adding that. And I was going to ask you, in addition to kind of the funding issues, are there any other sort of particular transportation challenges that Indiana is experiencing in terms of kind of the increased use in electric vehicles? Are there any other issues aside from the funding issues going on?
Yeah, I think electric vehicles are kind of the great unknown for us. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, however you would like to refer to it, they passed what's called the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, which aims to add in more charging stations across all of the alternative fuel corridors, so mostly interstates across the country. So Indiana really wants to take advantage of utilizing that federal funding to the most of its ability and providing more charging stations across the state. So that's another issue that is continually evolving. It's kind of a detriment to our state funding, but it's an increase to the federal funding that we are able to apply for. So a lot of NDOT resources have recently been put towards how do we participate in the electric vehicle front? How do we encourage private participation in electric vehicle charging stations? And how do we get community involvement to tell us where those need to be?
Very much. Turning to Michael, you mentioned doing a project in Clay County, which is actually the county that I live in. So I appreciate you helping us out over there, because we definitely need some help. But in particular, in terms of working in policy related to rural areas, based on the experiences that you've had thus far, what would you say are like the unique challenges when it comes to trying to do policy work when it comes to rural areas, trying to better serve rural areas?
So something I'm learning somewhat recently is that for most grants, you guys apply for SAMS.gov. A lot of these smaller towns are not having adequate records. So if somebody passes away who's been in a job for 20, 30 years, their information is just gone and they can't apply for federal grants. And that's really hurting people. Sometimes we're incorporating because of it. And just also, I would say government matching for grants. They don't have the funds to actually get their projects done because they don't have the funds to do their 50%, 20%, whatever it is for the grants.
So the first thing you mentioned was kind of the succession planning. I mean, there's people who stay in these positions for a long time, but there's no plan to eventually have somebody else come in and take it. And then obviously just funding, which I think for a lot of rural areas we would kind of expect that would be an issue.
So about 2-3 weeks ago, we started talking company wise about trying to set up a program to help with this kind of transitions. That they pay for a fee, we keep the records, and it's just one possibility in the future of just being able to safeguard some of these smaller communities.
That's a good idea. Turning to Andrea, in terms of your position and the work that you've done, what have you seen? Because obviously working at the state level, you've got to be concerned with Indianapolis and Evansville, the more urban metropolitan areas that we have, but also the rural areas in between. So how do you balance it, and what are the unique challenges that you've seen dealing with rural versus urban transportation concerns?
Yeah, I think so. Indiana is mostly a rural state. But even with their budgets combined, a lot of them can't compete with an Indianapolis or an Evansville or a Fort Wayne. So a lot of what the agency works through is how do we address these major cities where it's a high need, high use infrastructure system, but also have our rural communities who maybe don't have the high level of funding. They don't have a wheel tax. They don't have other types of funding mechanisms available to them. But how do we maintain their infrastructure at the same rate? So a large part of that, of what the agency can do to help is both through state and federal legislation. So we have rural programs that are specifically designed for federal legislation to help them get more adequate funding to address their needs. Especially our more rural counties, they have a dedicated bridge program on the federal level for them. And then on the state side, with larger municipalities, they are more represented through their MPOs and different infrastructure planning groups. So we try to make sure that we reach out to all the different communities as often as we can. We have a dedicated division within our agency for local programs. And then we also try to meet with their stakeholder groups. So we're lucky to have different associations who represent rural communities that represent our more populous municipalities. So it's making sure that we give all those stakeholders equal weight and trying to address their concerns as equitably as we can with the funding that we're allocated.
Thank you. And MPOs, just to be, you're talking about nonprofit organizations?
Yeah, so metropolitan planning organizations.
Okay, metropolitan planning. Okay. So this next one's a question for both of you, although Michael kind of raised it in one of his answers, talking about kind of participation. And you mentioned, the task force that's going on for funding Indiana roads, and obviously Michael's doing things here locally where they're trying to get, community input. And Michael noted it as a challenge, getting people to show up. So if you could kind of, expand a little bit on kind of, and one question that I have is, we talk about the people who aren't showing up. So I guess the question I have is, who is showing up? Like, what kind of people are actually showing up to these meetings, and like, what are their concerns, or what are their motivations for showing up when so many other people are not showing up at these meetings?
So this past Monday, I'm also working on a Wabash Riverfront master plan, trying to set one up, present to the city councilors and stuff. We sent out 309 letters to homeowners that's close to the Wabash River. And we got roughly 10 homeowners to show up one day. We were there for about an hour and a half. And those are the ones that did show up. One was from the mill, one's from the Hendricks Center, I think it's called. One was one of the car dealership previous owners and stuff. So it's just like the bigger theaters were coming, but the individual homeowners were not. And we had maybe 3 or 4. And just being able to bring people involved. Like we said, hey, we're taking your property, which we weren't. This is just a plan. People will get upset, but that could be a couple years from now when we're trying to talk about, hey, we might take a little bit part so we can put a sidewalk in or something like that. That's when they'll, we never heard about this before. We object to this, but they had years to learn more about it. So when it basically starts affecting them, that's when they're probably showing more of a voice.
So the people who are showing up then, are they all people who are kind of either opposed or at least concerned about the project? Is anybody showing up that's, showing up because they're in favor of the development?
I think the mood's pretty much positive right now. I haven't seen a negative interaction yet.
Good.
So that's from like 3 or 4 community events I've been to. It's usually just positive. but just numbers of.
Okay. Andrew, what about from your perspective, as far as getting public participation and who is participating and
Sure. So we kind of find that the polar entities for participation are there. So it's kind of like your Yelp reviews. It's those who are absolutely opposed to it and those who really support it. It's kind of capturing that middle group who, maybe care in one direction or the other, but it's just not enough for them to have an opinion. And so they don't participate or don't engage. For the agency, for us, is a struggle that we have a federally and state mandated public involvement process. It's through the National Environmental Protection Act. And through we have to do our public involvement, and oftentimes that's very early on in the planning. So most transportation projects are 5 to 7 years in advance, and we're having public involvement, 5 to 3 years before we actually break ground. And so there's a struggle with people not realizing. They say, "Oh, it's not happening anytime soon. It's not going to affect me. I don't care right now. I'll think about it later." And then we get closer to the project and we start announcing different deliverables. We're breaking ground. They'll start seeing cones. They'll start seeing detours, and they are kind of jarred. And then they start getting upset, or then they start to have an opinion. So for us, the struggle is communicating within that gap of when we have to complete the mandatory public involvement, and then when the project starts. So how do we kind of keep them informed along the way to make sure that we're adequately addressing any concerns or needs throughout that time?
And that kind of segues into my next question, and I'll stick with Andrea for this one to start off with. So as far as, and I think it was you in one of your answers talked about, balancing competing interests, and now, in any situation where you've got a public policy issue, there's going to be competing interests, and there's going to be some people, I don't want to say winners and losers, but some people are going to gain more than others, and trying to balance those interests. So from your perspective, in terms of trying to improve transportation in Indiana, recognizing that, there are these competing interests, how do you communicate with those people who may see themselves as being on the losing end and try to convince them, that this is either good for the state as a whole, or eventually it will benefit them in the long run? What kind of strategies or approach do you take to that?
Sure. We typically try to go with as much of a data-driven approach as possible. So we try to remove a lot of the emotional sentiments maybe our project planners have, or maybe the constituency that has the concern. So often for the agency, our projects are either driven by safety or for an asset maintenance need. So communicating that, so, it needs to be safer. We need to improve mobility. The road's deteriorating, which is why we have to do this project. So most of the time, there's still always going to be people who are upset that we're doing a project, we're impacting their access or their property or just their way of life that they've had for 30 years. And now we're kind of changing, we're adding a turn lane, and that changes how they do their daily commute. So really taking in what their emotional concerns are, but trying to help them see the data and asking them to provide data of their own. Maybe the turn lane geometry we have near their farm field doesn't work for their combine. And so we need to recalculate how we do their turn radius. So really trying to find what data points we can find a gray area or find a compromise on, to make sure that even if they feel like they're a loser, maybe they aren't losing on all points. Maybe it's just a few.
Thank you. Michael, did you want to add anything on that?
So something I noticed with the trails, like we're just talking about possibility from point A to point B, and people like, you're not taking our land, you're not taking our land, not taking our land, stuff like that. We just have to stress to them that we're not taking their land. We're not going to do eminent domain and just grab in, give them pennies for the dollar. It's more of, we're trying to find ways to make pedestrians, especially children and elderly, be able to get to the hospitals and the schools, and just trying to get that part of the motion into them instead of just like, we're taking stuff from.
Very good. So and again, if anybody online has any questions, feel free to jump in. I was curious if either Andrea or Michael, if either of you had questions for the other, based on what we've talked about, or.
Well, I've just noticed that I'm only in my third month, or been doing this for years, so I can see possibly where I could be better articulate what I'm saying, like you're better articulating than I am so far. But stuff you're saying is like, yes, I know at least 25%, maybe a little bit more, just learning more through the process.
Now, I've worked with your organization before, so I'm curious to get to know you, and maybe we'll cross paths in other types of transportation planning and community planning. So just interested to hear like what your organization's priorities are for the upcoming fiscal years, and what you guys are concerned about and what you are really focusing on.
So the answer, I think there's gonna be a little bit of transition. We're in community development, which is gonna be more on the rural transportation side, focusing only. And there's gonna be a little bit of changes that I'm not privy to pretty much. Just like, we're gonna start focusing more, like I'm working more with Clay County, we're gonna try to get other counties that we work in, which is like Vermilion, Montgomery, Park, Sullivan, trying to get their sidewalks inventories done, signage inventories. We do traffic counts for the city. We're just trying to get better information to lawmakers and databases and stuff like that.
In terms of, and I asked previously, as far as, what you would like to see, public administration research or courses, what sort of issues you want them to pay more attention to. Are there any other, either courses or skills or, anything else, the program didn't offer, and you kind of learned on the job, and what was the most prominent thing you would say, you kind of got on the job training with that? Michael, you may be you may be still going through it. So I'll start with Andrea. So what was the most prominent thing that you kind of had to learn on the go?
Sure. As I'm an introvert at heart, so I say this, and I know fellow introverts will probably like cringe when I say this, but public speaking training is one of those things that I wish I had more experience in my previous role and in my current role now. So taking this opportunity is just another professional development for me as well. Really stretching that muscle of how do I answer questions strategically? How do I communicate best to folks who maybe don't know the same facts or figures that I do, but how do I formulate a response that really resonates with them? So public speaking, getting used to working with groups and individuals who you don't interact with on a daily basis, networking with different folks. So just really a course on kind of professional presentation is something that I would have really valued.
Very introverted also. Public speaking is something on stuff like you just said, yes. What I was thinking of stages of government processes. Like, okay, you get the grant, now you have to send out bids. Then once you get the bids, you have to do the scoring of the engineering firms. Then that's when construction happens. Then you have the environmental studies, what stages to actually get from, okay, we want to do this to actually finishing it. Because like it takes years to get everything finished from point A to point B, but just learning the processes.
Yes, I think that's a good suggestion. So we focused obviously a lot on transportation for obvious reasons, but maybe looking a little bit more broadly in terms of economic and community development. What would you say? And maybe trying to look a little bit outside of the transportation realm directly, what would you say are the biggest economic and/or community development needs in Indiana right now? And what would you, if you had, if you had the power to make something happen, what would be the thing that would be your highest priority to get it done?
So I have two.
Go ahead.
Education. Make sure we have top-notch schools and people who come to school here stays in here, not the brain drain. Then affordable housing. I know one of our subdivisions in Thrive is about bringing, is housing, about bringing affordable housing to the community. But if you want people to stay here, they need people to have affordable, nice homes. Yeah, that's what that would be.
Yeah, similar to Michael, I think education and housing are critical, but I also hope that communities and different businesses or organizations that want to come to Indiana or expand in Indiana are really doing some long-term strategic thinking and how their business will impact a community. Um, do they have the infrastructure in place? Do they have the utilities in place? Pipelines for broadband, internet. Indiana is still not everyone in the state has internet. We've had discussions about water availability come across different states. So, are they doing the appropriate planning to make sure that the location they want to go in can handle the growth? And then on top of that, Indiana has a thriving rural farming community. So, how do we leverage which businesses are best for Hoosiers and the skill sets that we have? So, we also need that education prong, but how do we rank different business opportunities, or do we help elevate some existing businesses? So I think there's a lot to contemplate for organizations and economic development planners on what is the best expansion of that for our workforce.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. So we've had a couple of things mentioned, specifically in terms of public administration education, work behavior, budgeting. So in terms of how things actually operate within public or nonprofit organizations, is there anything in particular that you learned about in the program that you've seen in operation, or conversely, what was the biggest difference kind of between kind of the book version of organizational behavior versus the actual version of organizational behavior that you see in practice? So, Andrea, we'll start with you since you're a little more seasoned.
Yeah. I would say just the amount of communication needed. So over communicating to everyone who might have a piece and a part of the process. I think in some of the books they talk about managing up and managing down and how you deal with superiors of different divisions. Having that respect for everyone who has their subject matter expertise and communicating well so everyone feels included and that they have the appropriate buy-in into a project and a program really goes a long way. So it wasn't one of those things that I had really thought about. I was like, oh, everybody's busy. They don't want a ton of emails in their inbox. I don't want to bother someone too much. But I think people would rather be bothered with more emails to be informed and to be knowledgeable than the latter. So that was one kind of quick thing that I had to learn early on was over communicate. It will probably serve you better than under communicating.
That's a really interesting suggestion, Michael.
So my background's in medical supplies. I work in nursing units and surgical centers at different hospitals. How they organize things is much different than the nonprofit I'm working in. Like my office is just down the hall from the CEO. I'm able to have lunch with him, talk to him. They have a guy that comes in once or twice a week and talks with all the new people for the first month, and he comes back after 6 months and say, how are we treating you? What can we do to better transition you into the jobs? And just they just want us to feel comfortable and heard. Some bigger organizations just dismiss what you say, but this company I'm working in is trying to understand what we're coming through. They have a book philosophy called 40X of how we have companies' goals. What can we do to try to meet and succeed those goals? And my first week or two, I had a book that flipped through when I first got there. And then every Tuesday morning, we have a half-an-hour meeting. It's like, this is what we did last week. What are you going to do this week to try to make sure we get our goals met? Just, they're more direct with us than I've had in the past.
So more of a kind of a systematic process, making sure that there is actual regular progress as opposed to just kind of giving you something to work on and then checking, just maybe checking periodically.
My supervisor, she was stressed on the first interview, work-life balance, and that's what I've noticed. In the hospitals, sometimes you have to be there, more than when you need to be. And then you have attitudes when there's conflicts. But so far in this one, that's it.
So the other topic that got brought up specifically was budgeting. And I don't want to ask anybody to be critical necessarily of the budgeting process, because I know politically that can be a little touchy, but in terms of improving budgeting, and I mean, you can look at it at the local, state, I mean, you can even, the federal budgeting process, I think everybody would say needs a lot of improvement. But in terms of better addressing kind of how we go about budgeting for different priorities, what would be the one big improvement that you might suggest for making the budget process a more rational process, if you want to put it in those terms? So, Andrea, did you want to take that?
I think Indiana we have a part-time legislature, which is kind of a blessing and a curse. So a lot of the public involvement process for people to be involved in the budget, to come testify on a budget or to state their priorities, is really confined every 2 years to, a handful of months. And so I think one of my suggestions would be, how do we as a state government, as a legislative body, improve the ability for constituents to have an impactful way to talk about the budget more regularly with their representatives. There's, good and bad to everyone and how they approach their constituencies. But I think if more people knew how to engage in the process and knew when it was most available for them to come engage, that would go a long way in making people feel like they have more buy-in and the tax dollars that they're contributing to the state.
Michael, how about you?
So I'm not too far into all the budgeting yet, but one thing I have noticed out, like you said, some people like, this road needs to be fixed now. We're actually affected by it, so let's fix it now. It's just we need some type of public education that, yes, we want this, but there's other areas in the city that needs improvement more or has been needed longer. So if we work on the road, but that could be 3, 4, or 5 years from now, because the city or this place we're working on now has waited that 3, 4, 5 years. And if I'm incorrect, it might be like NDOT, when they have a plan, like they'll set something up now, but it won't be 5 years till it's actually implemented. So there is a lag. We know, yes, we need to fix it, but there's other reasons why it takes so long to actually get there. So just public education on budgeting, I guess the processing.
Thanks very much. So is there anything you would like to add that we haven't discussed so far? So somebody who's aspiring to either your kind of position or a position in the public or a nonprofit sector in general, what would be the single biggest piece of advice you would give somebody in that situation? So Andrea, we'll start with you.
I would say job shadow or intern, or find a way to get engaged with people who are in the field that you are most interested in. I learn a lot hands-on in my career, and I really advocate for people taking the time, even if it's just a day or just a week, to be involved, to really see how the process works and to see if it's, the lifestyle they want. Do they want to work in government or a nonprofit, or to see if they think they can make the impact they want in that kind of position. So there's a lot of people who feel called to civil service, and I hope that a lot of them take the opportunity to really shadow different types of what that service looks like, because even across agencies, it's different. And so I really encourage people to get out and try to meet different folks in different positions and different subject matter fields.
Very, very good suggestion. Michael, what about you?
Say, find a topic that you're okay with doing for the next 5-10 years. It doesn't have to be your passion, but find something that you'll be able to tolerate. Then educate yourself. There's books out there, there's webinars to attend, there's conferences to attend. I wish I would have done more of that when I was graduate school. Just self-education, just don't just do the school work. Prove yourself first.
Yeah. And I think there, you know, something really struck a chord with me about that, because there is, you know, sometimes it takes you a while to figure out exactly what your passion is. Like, you may have a sense of, I want to work in government, or I want to work in the nonprofit sector, but you know, sometimes the things you end up getting really invested in, like in my career, I've ended up doing a lot in the area of public health, which isn't something that I ever thought about as I was going through graduate school, or, you know, it's something that came very late in the process. So I think, you know, going along with what Michael said, leaving yourself open to possibilities or areas of interest that maybe you wouldn't have thought were going to be your passion, you know. I think sometimes, you know, you're convinced that something is gonna be, you know, this is gonna be what I'm gonna do, and you kind of have blinders on, or sometimes you disregard things because you think, well, I'm not interested in that, or I don't have the skills or the knowledge for that. But sometimes, you know, you can acquire that over time. You know, there's, you know, if you're really passionate about something, you shouldn't disregard it just because you think you don't have certain skills or knowledge or what have you. So to wrap up again, you know, one last call, if anybody in the audience has any questions, I think. So we did get a question from Adam. He actually had a comment. So he said, have to leave for another commitment. While I'm still in the MBA program, I did find much of this conversation very relatable and similar to my own professional experiences in city government. Appreciate the effort. So Adam, I had to leave, but I appreciate him leaving that comment there. And if anybody else has anything, but in the meantime, is there anything that I didn't ask you, any questions I didn't ask you that you would like to answer? Or anything you'd like to add that you feel is important information?
Start networking now.
Start networking now. Yeah. Andrea, would you second that?
100%. So if anybody, I want to offer the opportunity, if anybody wants to grab coffee or grab lunch, I'm on the road a lot with transportation. So I could be in your area of the state sometime. So let me know. I'm happy to network with folks, because I never know who I'm going to meet and who I'm going to have to work with in the future. So it's always good to meet people.
Well, I will say that one of my reasons for doing these is to strengthen the network between graduates of the program and people in the program, and also, you know, either prospective MPA students, you know, undergraduates who might move into the MPA program, or just undergraduates that, you know, might not be even going into graduate school right away, but still need a network, you know, because they want to work in government, they want to work in the nonprofit sector, but maybe they're not going to go into a master's program right away. So this, you know, ideally this will start to help maybe some of that networking process. I may be calling upon, you know, you two and the other people who are participating in the other panels for other things in the future. So to the extent that you can do it, because obviously you're very busy. But I appreciate, Andrea and Michael, again, I appreciate you taking the time today. Those of you who are online, I appreciate you taking the time to view it, and anybody who might be watching this recording. And if anybody has any questions or wants to follow up on anything, you know, my name is Nathan Myers. I'm in the political science department at Indiana State, so I'm pretty easy to find. But in the meantime, everybody have a good rest of your day, and thanks everybody for your time and attention.
Thank you all. Have a good afternoon.
You too, thanks.
See ya.